So I'm gonna end this with a case study, which I think is really important for you guys to see something like this in action. So we had this house, right? It's sitting on it's a off grade, it's a crawl space. So it's got this crawl space, and this is what it looks like underneath it. Well, right off the bat, if we're thinking about building science, there's no thermal barrier, right? Thermal barrier meaning there's no insulation here to separate the home and the crawl space. What's another problem? Well, there's no vapor barrier. Now, you could say, oh, your vapor barrier is right here. Well, nah, I don't really like to put a vapor barrier there because it doesn't help you with the vapor in the actual air, right? So I would say there's no vapor barrier against the subfloor either. What about an air barrier? Well, if we're dealing with a house that's from like the 30s, 40s, do you think that this subfloor that you're looking at right here is airtight? Hell no, that ain't airtight, right? So there's no thermal barrier, there's no vapor barrier, there's no air barrier. What we're talking about today is an air barrier. And I wanted to note here, you see that there are pollutants in here, right? You have crawl space air, and you even have mold growth happening on the joists underneath you. So it's really important to separate yourself from the crawl space. But if you do it wrong, you're gonna have issues. So let me show you what happened here. The flooring installers decided to add a vapor barrier in this very leaky home. And in Florida, the last thing you want to do is add a vapor barrier right here, where they added it. Where did they add it? They added it inside the building envelope. Why is that important? Well, in Florida, we have more moisture outside than we do inside for the vast majority of the year. So if there's more moisture outside than there is inside, where do you think that vapor is going to go? Vapor pressure, just like regular pressure, goes from high to low, right? So you're going to have vapor trying to get in the house like this, right? And it's going to push through the wood just fine, but it's going to slap into this vapor barrier. And what do you think is going to happen when it hits that vapor barrier? It's going to stop. Do you ever think it's going to go back the other way? Not in Florida. No way. So what's going to happen? Well, you're going to start getting mold growth right here against your subfloor and against the backside of the vapor barrier. So how do you solve this? What is the solution? Well, an air barrier and a vapor barrier would help a lot. Where do you put the air and vapor barrier? You put it right here. You stop it at the source. You stop the air at the source. You stop the vapor at the source. And ideally, you would be using closed cell spray foam, which is vapor tight. And now, when that vapor tries to drive in, it cannot, right? And the air cannot. This is what it looked like on the back side of this vapor barrier that they installed on the underside of the flooring. So this is all mold growth. It's been tested for mold growth. And I don't know if you've seen these or not, but I just wanted to note, this is what was happening in the house. There was about, in the bedroom, you can't really see, let me move my face. In the bedroom here, there were around 2,300 spores of what we say is Penicillium aspergillus per cubic meter. So about every step you take, you're walking into about 2,600 spores of these, what we would consider a health risk. So the whole house is affected, right? So what's the remediation plan for these guys? What did they do in this situation to remediate? Well, you got to rip all the floors up, right? You got to get the floors up. You got to get that nasty vapor barrier off. You got to clean all the floors. You got to scrub the entire house down. All right, so you do all that stuff, and then what happens once they're done doing that is you have an inspector come back to check their work. Did you guys clean it properly? Is everything dry now before we rebuild? Let's do some air samples, make sure that things are back to normal, right? We don't have super high elevations, that you cleaned properly after them doing this entire home. Well, what mistake did they make here? I want you to see what they're doing with this machine. This is an air purifier that they're using right here, right? And what this air purifier is doing, there's an inlet. So it's actually pulling in air from the room and it's exhausting it outside. The reason that remediators do this is to create a negative pressure, right? And they do this to protect other areas, to prevent cross-contamination. So if I was remediating this office and my family was here, we would set up a containment, we would run negative pressure. That way everything I'm doing in here and I'm ripping things up, those spores aren't affecting the rest of the house. Everything is coming to me. But why are they running negative air pressure, which is designed to prevent cross-contamination, if they're remediating the entire home? It doesn't make sense, right? The reason that they're doing this is because this is just what they learned to do. This is what they were taught. Run negative air pressure when you do remediation. They're not using any level of building science. They're not using any critical thinking skills. They're just doing the same old on every job. What's the problem with this in this particular job? Well, this is a very air leaky house. And so as they're running negative air pressure, they're pulling crawl space air in. And this is what happened. They were pulling all this crawl space air in, and this is what the technician's supervisor told me. The technicians would call them up. Hey boss, we're dealing with this house and it's getting really musty smell. It smells like a crawl space in here. We don't know how to stop it. Why do you think it smelled like a crawl space? Because you're running negative air and you're pulling all this crawl space air through this leaky subfloor. Well, what does the supervisor do? Does he tell them to stop the negative air? No, he says, I got a brilliant idea, guys. Go get some 6 mil plastic the floors down, staple it, tape it, and let's prevent that crawl space air from coming in. So they spent, this plastic's expensive. Think about how long it took them to do this. They stapled it all down. It looks good. Complete waste of time. All they had to do was just unplug this thing from the wall and they would have been good. But they don't understand. So they sealed all this up and they continue running their negative air like, oh my God, our boss is a genius. It worked. It doesn't smell from the crawl space anymore. Let's continue our work. Well, I show up for the actual post remediation to check and see their work. And I see this and I'm like, what's up with the bounce house here, right? Why do you think it's inflated like this? That's because air is trying to get back in. They're creating this negative air pressure in here and they're fighting this air from the crawl space in the peak summer. So I pull back this plastic. What do you think I see underneath this plastic? Mold. Fresh mold growing. Why? Because they were pulling hot, humid air in and they put a vapor barrier down and they were stopping the moisture, and fresh mold grew all over the subfloor again within a matter of a couple weeks. So they literally just did the same mistake that they're there to remediate, because they don't understand air pressure. They don't understand the mechanics of what their machines are. They're not using critical thinking skills. So this is just another example of why it's so important to understand these things, no matter what field you're in. If you're a remediator, you got to know this stuff. If you're an inspector, you have to know how to identify these things. That way we can help them. And also, if you're writing a protocol for something like this, you probably want to tell them, hey, don't use negative air in this situation, right? Because you know better than they do. And of course, just in general, when you're finding houses like this, even if you're an energy auditor, look at this situation and say, hey, we got to really be careful of pressure imbalances in this house. Let's find these areas of air infiltration using our blower door as one of our tools to try to help create a healthier home, because the last thing we want is crawl space air coming into our house. So I wanted to end with this. I hope that helps. And again, this is not a building science course. This is just for a blower door, but I did think this was really important. I do emphasize how important it is to understand air pressure in more detail. That way you can utilize it on your investigations.